Okay, thanks you guys for coming in, and I hope you had a lovely dinner, lots of desserts. I know there was a great conversation out there, and so now we're gonna listen a little bit and then we'll have some more conversation. And without getting into anything else, I want to introduce you to Dr. Smith. So let me highlight her here. There we go. Okay, so it is my privilege and joy to introduce you to Dr. Emily Smith. Dr. Smith is an epidemiologist in global public health and the author of The Science of the Good Samaritan, one book that many of us have already read. If you haven't yet and you want to, some people who had copies have returned them that we can share them with you as well. We bought about 20 copies for the church and people have been enjoying reading them. Dr. Smith is an assistant professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine Surgery at Duke University and at the Duke Global Health Institute. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she also became known as the friendly neighbor epidemiologist through her social media outlets. They reached more than 3 million people a month in 2020 and 2021, and this is how I met her. And I really appreciate her perspective on caring for others using the Good Samaritan model that God has taught us. Emily lives with her pastor husband, their 2 fantastic children, 1 spoiled golden retriever, and a rambunctious golden doodle. From what I gather, Dr. Smith would have much preferred to be sitting in the courtyard with us sharing conversation over our church soup supper, but getting to Michigan for an evening is time and cost prohibitive. So I'm gonna give it up to Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Kristen. Oh, I can see people clapping. Y'all are so kind. This is just one of my favorite things is to get to talk to churches about this. So I'm just thrilled y'all invited me. Not all churches do anymore, so I just am appreciative of that. Kristen is right. I would have loved to have had dinner and chatted your ear off. If I sit by you on an airplane, I will just apologize in advance. I tend to be chatty, hence the name for the friendly neighbor epidemiologist. And thank you for going through the book. I'm going to talk about a lot of those stories from the book. And so you'll just see the pictures that will hopefully resonate with you. And also I've got some data from y'all's area, and we'll talk about that and why it matters to neighboring. And, you know, when Kristen asked if I would do this was months ago, and a lot has changed in the world for sure, especially here in the States. And so you will hear a little bit of that probably throughout, especially how it affects my work, because it certainly does detrimentally. And then we'll leave time for discussion at the end. But let me just jump in. You can see the screen. Can you also see me? I hit the right. Okay, cool. Well, this is the title of my book, The Science of the Good Samaritan, but what does that really mean and how I came about it? There we go. Before we get going, I always start my talks with an acknowledgement of who I am and maybe more importantly, who I'm not. I'm going to be talking a lot about the communities that I work in and neighboring and global settings, and nearly all of them are in areas that I did not grow up in, that I don't look like, I don't speak the language. And so there's just an acknowledgement of who I am, especially in that first paragraph. I'm a straight, white, Christian, cis female woman from the United States who graduated and works in high-income universities. Or universities in high-income countries, and that denotes some privilege, even if it's unconscious. And so I also talk about where I grew up and their original lands, and that I work in to the day. So let me take you back. This is 1980 something. I don't remember. That's me in kindergarten. You know, we had to make those big about me projects. It's full of glitter, and I said I wanted to be 2 things. I wanted to be Sandy Patty. Anybody know who Sandy Patty is in the audience? Oh, good. I'm getting head nods. Yes and no. You never know. I just loved her. I wrote her a letter when I was 11 on purple stationery. It's fine. Never heard back, but you never know. One day. So I wanted to be her. She's a singer. It did not work out, which is totally fine. But I also wanted to be a missionary. My parents were worship leaders in our charismatic church, and we were the home where the missionaries would come and stay. And I just remember peppering them with way too many questions because I was chatty as a 9-year-old even then. And I just basically asked, how did you get to where you are and what are you doing? And I just was hooked on wanting to be a missionary. And like most of us, I thought the only way to do that was to go for a pre-med program. So I went to Wayland Baptist University. It's in the Panhandle of Texas. Tiny, tiny town, tiny university, but lovely. And I was a double major in biology and chemistry in the pre-med. And one summer I went and met the first female scientist I'd ever met or read about, which this you see in the picture. Her name is Dr. Strallendorf, and I would do my science fair project with her at Texas Tech University and got hooked on science. I just loved it and did science fairs, all of the fun nerd stuff. And it's fine because it paid for college, so nerds work out sometimes. So I graduated, and the year before I was going to go to medical school, or the summer before, I went on the Mercy Ship. And this is a medical mission boat. It is still going on. They actually have multiple other boats, and they dock in countries that need a lot of medical care. So we were docked in Honduras, and I helped in the kitchen, but on the days when I didn't have to work, I would go out with the medical clinics. And I noticed a couple of things here. I noticed that I was asking not really questions of how to treat one-on-one people, which is medicine. I was asking bigger picture questions like, why is poverty so bad in this area? And why are these children from this village coming sicker than others? I didn't know it at the time, but that's an epidemiology question. If you think of what epidemiology is, prior to the pandemic, a lot of people thought we were skin doctors, like epidermis. I got asked that a lot. Now people kind of know. Medicine is treating one-on-one people. The epidemiology is treating communities instead of people. It's population level health. So I would end up getting married that summer as well. You can see my husband there. Been married for 22 years to, his name is Mike. He's a pastor. His first pastorate was all the way in South Carolina, so I had a gap year. So I decided, well, let's just get another degree because it'll help me get into medical school. So I enrolled as a Master of Public Health student. And day one of epidemiology, I didn't know what it was at the time, but they said the science of epidemiology is figuring out who is sick and choosing to do something about it. And as a person of faith, it seemed like that was the story of the Good Samaritan. It's quantifying who is at need on a population level and then choosing not to walk by. So I would pivot and went and got my PhD instead of medical school, and that the rest is kind of history. But most of you are familiar with that story of the Good Samaritan. I was too. I grew up with it. It's that story of a man who's on the side of the road and very sick. Two people walk by, and you can see him in the background, a priest and a Levite. And at the time, they denoted power and privilege of the day. But a Samaritan man, who is not at all who you would have thought would have stopped, and he bandaged up the man. And here's what I missed as a kid. He took him to a place to recover, and then he paid for all of it. And in my line of work, which I'll tell you about, is the intersection of poverty and children's health. Poverty is one of the number one predictors of healthcare or not getting care at all. We see that hearkened in this story too. To me, that also resonates with other religions. So when I, as Kristen told you, I was the friendly neighbor epidemiologist during COVID, I still am. And when I started writing about loving our neighbor through masks and vaccines, staying home, protecting the vulnerable, I started getting a lot of influx of people wanting to partner from other religions. And so we did. So in the book, I'm sure you've seen this, but that love your neighbor sentiment, it transcends all of the world's greatest religion. And then at the very bottom, you see a quote of love your neighbor. That's just being a good human. That's my youngest who said that during COVID when he couldn't understand why people wouldn't mask or vaccine. So I don't think you have to be a person of any religion. It certainly helps motivate, but you don't have to really be one of a religion to just want to be a good neighbor. The question is, how do we do that? Especially now. This book came out prior to everything that is happening, but this question, how do we live as neighbors in heart and deed in a world that's made it to do quite the opposite? And I think the approach is to do the and also approach. the bandaging up the needs like we saw in the Good Samaritan story, and also making sure they have a place to recover, making sure it doesn't bankrupt them. For us nowadays, I think it is giving money to a food pantry, it is sponsoring children. Those are all holy work. But it's, and also, does the rest of our life reflect neighboring as well? So to me, I think the hardest way to do that, and why I started the book with this section of how to do it, is centering. Because something made that Samaritan man stop while the others didn't. And I think something intrinsically was just in his heart already centered on wanting to help, or for us people of faith, it's Jesus and his example. And so how do we do that? And for me, it's at being a little science history nerd. I think it's important for us to know the history of people that we want to love, communities and individuals. So let me tell you about my work. This is in Berlin, Germany in 1885. It's called the Berlin Conference, or you might know it if you're good history buffs as the Great Scramble. Around that horseshoe table, there are 14 high-income countries, all white men. Two of them had been to the continent of Africa, but no one from the continent was there, nor were they given entry to come. If you look at the back of that grainy picture, do you see the map of Africa? The end result of this meeting was who gets to splice and dice the continent into colonial powers. Now, in 1880, if you look at that map, these are the natural cultures and ethnicities and countries and groups that the people defined for themselves. At the end of that Berlin conference, 90% of the continent would be colonized. And if you look at where Lake Victoria is in the 1913 map, it looks like someone just spliced and diced Lake Victoria just with a pencil, I mean, they probably did because they had never been to the continent. The problem is the countries, the natural ones that were spliced and diced, if you fast forward modern day, those are the countries that have the most civil unrest. You think Somalia, and poverty. So it's a double whammy. And I work in one of those countries. This is the country of Somaliland. So it was colonized by the British. It is technically a part of Somalia that was colonized by Italy. The problem with Somaliland is the fourth poorest country in the world by a margin, but it also has the highest rates of mothers and babies and infants dying in the world, 9 times higher than even neighboring Ethiopia. If when the WHO or the UN gives money to the poor countries of the world, it goes through Somalia and it has to funnel up to Somaliland, which rarely happens because it's not recognized as its own independent country. At the Berlin Conference, Somaliland and Somalia were one of the countries that were split in half by those that held power at the time that were doing it for colonial powers. And if you know your history, you know that colonizers certainly were not motivated by Jesus. And when Africa would get its freedom, Somaliland would get its freedom in the 60s, what happened is all of the doctors and all of the teachers and all of the educators and nurses left with that because they didn't mobilize the country itself. So when we're talking about the end also of neighboring, and I work in a country like this, yes, they're poor, and yes, with the highest rates of civil unrest and of mothers and babies dying, but it's of no fault of their own. We have to go back and actually learn the history of the place. Now, what we would do in Somaliland is we, with our partners, would try to find out of the 2 million children that are in the country, where are the ones that need the most need, and did they get to care, and why? Now, we found that 250,000 kiddos need some sort of health care. There's a lot of congenital anomalies, a lot of brain anomalies that happen in that country because of poverty, like a folic acid. Out of those 250,000, only 1,200 got care in a single year in all hospitals in the country. So our question is, how do we get that gap shorter then? 250,000 need care, 1,200 got it. What is happening? And out of the predictors that we looked at, we found that poverty was the number one reason why families couldn't get to care, regardless of their annual income or how many kids they had to feed. If there was a child in a household or in those huts like we just saw that had some sort of health need, they wouldn't be able to get it. And it was the number one marker of that whole family descending into poverty, perpetuating it, the lack of generational wealth you can see there, and never coming out of poverty. That was a huge finding because what we thought at Duke was it was going to be the number of kids they had to feed, or it was going to be how much money they have saved up. And even accounting for that, it was a child with a surgical or a health need that flung the family into poverty. That brings me to this slide. That was a big tee up to this slide. In 2019, we took that data to the United Nations, to the high-level meeting on universal health coverage. Now, for you nurses or medical people, when we talk about packages of care and what's covered on insurance schemes, for the world's poorest, it's typically only vaccinations or if someone gets, a minor cut. Something really detrimental like breaking a bone, having a congenital anomaly, getting really sick like appendicitis, that is not covered in these care plans. So we took our data to the tables here and asked, when we talk about universal health coverage for all, especially kids, we have to talk about surgery and cancer and some of these conditions that throw the families into poverty. The other picture that you're seeing is me fangirling out to the director, Dr. Tedros of WHO. That picture is accurate, and I have it in my office because I just loved him. You can see him on the big screen. He was actually at an Ebola outbreak, so he zoomed into this meeting. But what this showed me in real time is the and also of making sure those babies and those families have enough food on the ground, and also that there's some sort of policy protection even at these levels for the families itself. Now, I think we also have to think about neighboring in this and also approach, but also knowing the history of the place in the US. Some of you know what this picture is, but the man with his arms crossed, if you can see him on the edge, that's Dr. Marion Sims. The lady on the table, her name is Lucy. If you look at the other two ladies that are kind of peeking behind the curtain, that is Betsy and Anarka. Dr. Marion Sims, if any of you are doctors, you might know his name. He was past president of the American Medical Association. He has a medical school named after him. Women, if you go to your OB-GYN appointments and there's the speculum, it is the Sims speculum, that is from him. He's incredibly well known. He was also well known to doing a procedure on women who have fistulas. This is after childbirth when you tear too much where urine seeps out. It doesn't really hurt post-child, but it's pretty horrific because it's just debilitating for the mom. He perfected the procedure to actually fix that for women, but he used enslaved women like Lucy, Betsy, and Anarka to perfect that, and he did it without anesthesia. He would go on to, like I said, to be the president of AMA. He would do the procedure on white women, but this time it would be with anesthesia. Out of the 40 women that he did, the enslaved women that he did the procedures on, only these 3 are named by name and only first names. Lucy had multiple procedures and nearly died. This is all in his journal. If you fast forward to nowadays, and if you go to New York City and Central Park, around Central Park, there's one of 3 statues for Dr. Marion Sims. Now, a lot of advocacy went into play to take his down, and it's now where his statue stood is now a plaque that has 4 Lucy, Betsy, and Anarka, and the other unnamed women. That was through advocacy. But in Alabama, if you go to the Capitol, it still stands. Of him. If you go a mile away from where the Capitol, where that stands, you have this advocate who has built 3 statues, which is the other picture. Those are the 3, Lucy, Betsy, and Anarka. Lucy is the one in the middle with her abdomen cut out, and she's wearing a crown of the speculum. If you go actually to that same place in Alabama and right down the road, this picture is kind of reimagined from the advocate's role. And so now the person who's on the table is Marion Sims, and the person looking are the three women. This is where you all live. This is if you go back to the redlining in the 1940s, when they were given home loans to try to help people out of the Depression era and help people build generational wealth. What happened is some of the cities, if not all of them, were redlined. Y'all have heard that, I'm sure. The neighborhoods, they went neighborhood to neighborhood, and the green you can see are the neighborhoods that were basically where lenders would give home loans to. The red were known as dysfunctional, and the yellow were called declining. The problem is all of the red are fully 100% African American neighborhoods, and the yellows are predominantly mixed with white families, but because they border the red, they were called declining. If you fast forward nowadays, I see this in Durham as well. The homes that were redlined versus those in the green, same square footage, same green space, everything is the same between the two houses. But the equity in those homes are $40,000 to $90,000 lower per decade. So when we're thinking about building generational wealth or the lack thereof, history has a story to tell. I'm going to come back to talk about these neighborhoods and how that affects children's health in just a minute, but keep that in mind. I think something else that we have to take into account when we are centering is talking about what's called structural violence. Typically we think of violence that is just one-on-one, somebody hitting somebody or hurting somebody. Structural violence is that same concept, but it being a structure or a system. And let me show you what I mean. So when I was pregnant with my second, it was a month out, and I started seeing stars, and I just knew that doesn't seem right, but it didn't happen with my first. So I called my OB, and she said, "Yeah, you need to come in." So I was under observation, and they diagnosed me with severe preeclampsia. So he came very quickly that day. And that next month, both of us were in the hospital multiple times with him in the NICU, and they just could not get my blood pressure okay. But we had insurance. We were 10 minutes from the hospital. We had help. I had a nest egg to cover whatever the insurance wouldn't cover, and both of us lived. If you live in a place of another where that I work, this is Burundi. It's another one of the poorest countries in the world. It's a landlocked country. Same scenario, a mother who she's pregnant with her second, she starts seeing stars. She has to walk 6 to 8 hours just to get to a clinic and hope that they have the blood tests to be able to see what she has or not. Statistically, women who live in Burundi versus women like me in the US are 14 times higher to die of preeclampsia along with their child than me. Structural violence means it's of no fault of her own. It's the systems or the lack thereof around her. If we think of Burundi and you go back to the Great Scramble, Burundi was another one of those countries that were spliced and diced, and it has still some of the highest civil conquest to this day. So there's a history to be told. Now, to me, what that means is if you are a policy-directed type person, or you're thinking about how you want to help the poor in the world, it is helping, but it's also understanding there's a history here. Now, we also have to prepare for costs along the way, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but as Kristen mentioned, I started in March 2020 a Facebook page called Friendly Neighbor Epidemiologist because my mom and real life neighbors were asking, what does flatten the curve mean? I mean, a lot of people were, and so I started a Facebook. Let me just help. I'm a pastor's wife, and we were in Texas at the time at a very large mega church in the buckle of the Bible Belt. And when the pandemic started getting weirdly political, you guys saw this, I'm sure, just like I did. And people were saying, I'm not going to mask out because I have more faith, or I'm not going to get a vaccine because of something. I just thought as a person of faith and as a scientist, that's just not right. So I started writing about it. It could actually be an act of loving your neighbor. So it would keep going viral, and it would hit, like you heard, 10 million people over those years in 143 countries, which are still following me on Substack, and I'm just floored by it. there was really good people who would say, thank you for helping us figure out what this means. But then there were also things that came like this. This is one of the threats that I felt comfortable in sharing that came in the mailbox at my house. It was also followed up by, threats against my kids and pictures of guns and horrific stuff. I still get this stuff, but I don't say this to be pity or uncomfortable. I say it that, especially now in today's world, if you start neighboring in a way that sounds like Jesus and loving your neighbors, it can shake people the wrong way. And to just count the cost, that is that okay or not? And to me, it was okay. I mean, we certainly have security at this point now, and have a lot of a big team around us, but it will shake some feathers. And so the next step is, how do we get the courage then to live it out? And I'm going to land the plane on just ending about courage, because if you're here tonight, you could have done anything. You could have gone anywhere to eat or stayed at home and watched whatever. But you came, and so I'm not going to have to convince you that any of this is true, and for your heart to be broken by what Jesus would break his, or what did break his. But I think what we are going to have to need now in these days is courage. This picture is back. Some of you might recognize this picture from the New York Times. In 2013, Ebola would whammy West Africa. Now, Ebola is not a deadly disease. It is misunderstood to be deadly. It is only deadly if you're in a place that doesn't have supportive care or IV fluids and a good healthcare system around you. And I think you'll see why that's the case in just a minute. Prior to 2013, the picture that you see, his name is Dr. Khan. Dr. Khan, and you've read about him in the book for sure, he is the Tony Fauci or the Taylor Swift or the Patrick Mahomes, like whatever, whoever you want to say, of Africa. People know who he is. Prior to the big epidemic, he had been in the States advocating to Congress with some very well-known, including Dr. Fauci, legends for more health supplies, better health systems in their country. Because if something like Ebola or COVID hit their hospital, they are not ready for it. So they were given a couple of, walls and a couple of gowns and beds, but not really what was needed. So when it hit West Africa, they were not prepared. Dr. Khan would end up getting this, would get Ebola, and within 5 days, you're just detrimentally sick. They didn't have what they could at his hospital, his own hospital, to take care of him, so they transferred him to a Doctors Without Borders facility in a neighboring country. He kept going downhill, and they had to make a decision of, do they give him a vaccine called ZMapp, ZMAPP. Now, at the time, that was an experimental vaccine against Ebola. It has since become non-experimental. It's now known that it works. But there were only 3 vials in the world, one of which was at his health facility. So of course, you can just imagine they had to make all these awful decisions, but it was made where he would not receive ZMapp. A couple of days later after that, he would pass away without any of his family, and one friend was finally allowed to come with him at the end. The other picture you see is another physician who would get sick 2 weeks within when Dr. Khan got sick in a neighboring country. Same thing, got sick real quick. They had to make the decision, does he get ZMapp? Not only that, can we medevac him to the US? It was asked that Dr. Khan would be medevaced, but they didn't have an airplane equipped, like you see in the movies with the HEPA filters to keep everybody safe. So it was denied. The other one was given access to the US. You might have seen this video on the news. I certainly watched it as an epidemiologist, but they took him to Nebraska to that state-of-the-art NIH facility. He would get ZMapp, and a couple of weeks after getting it and improving, he would walk out of the hospital alive. He is Kent Brantley, if you know that name. He was a Samaritan's Purse missionary. The question is, why did he get it, and why did Dr. Khan not? Sure. But to me, the question was who gets to decide who gets what? ZMAP, yes, at an individual level, but also at a policy level. If you think about during the pandemic, the US and high income countries would gobble up the world stockpile of vaccines and of oxygen. Who gets to make these decisions, and who or what countries are worthy of that or not? I think as a global neighbor, and certainly as people of faith, we need to wrestle with that. All that to say, too, if this was any one of our family members, you better believe we all would have moved heaven and earth to get them to a state-of-the-art facility to live. I would have too. But the question is that, and also, why wasn't it there for Dr. Khan or his people? You might remember this picture too. This is during COVID, during the second wave. This is in India. And if you remember, that wave was the worst in the world that hit the country like a tsunami. Daily, there were 400,000 people getting COVID, and that would last for 5 weeks. Now, India is big, but it is not that big. So they just ran out of everything pretty much, and we're doing these mass funerals, which is what you see here. They tell stories of the hospitals just running out of oxygen. The one I wrote about in the book is one of the main ones in New Delhi that had 26 ventilators and through the night ran out of power and oxygen. And by that next morning, 24 had died. So who gets to decide who gets the oxygen or who gets the vaccines, who gets the PPE to protect themselves? If you talk to my team in Somaliland, they ran out of PPE and could not get any more. So they were covering their hands. This is during COVID. They were covering their hands and trying to tape it up with Kleenex, which we all know is not going to work. So let me come back down a little bit from those 30,000 foot level questions and talk about how do we do that. I think for me, it is living in accompaniment. And this is it's a posture. It's different than doing global health or neighboring for and on people, which sounds very colonial. Instead, it's doing it with and beside. I love this quote from Pope Francis that accompaniment teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. And if I could just add, it's because the ground is holy. If you are walking beside somebody who doesn't have shoes and you give them, there's a reverence and there's a dignity that we give them, regardless if they can afford it or not. That's a heart posture to take off our sandals because the sacred ground is holy around those that we're trying to serve. Not serve over, but serve with. The second, and this might ruffle some people, so I'll just ask to hang in with me for a little bit. Father Gustavo Gutierrez lived in the slums of Peru until he was 95. He died last year, I'm sorry. He wrote this quote: "The poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action. It's the and also, but a demand that we go and build a different social order." What our data has also shown is that if we start investing in the poor first, the trickle up economics is a 1 to 10 or 14 return of investment. Another way to say that is for every dollar we put into serving the poor, building the hospitals, making sure people have good housing that they can afford, you get a return of investment to the economy for 14 times that. That's a trickle up economy. The other way, the trickle down economy, which is kind of how capitalism is set up right now, is just a 1 to 1 return of investment, and that rarely flows down to the poorest of the poor. So perhaps neighboring in a global sense and even in a US sense is seeing the opposite of trickle up effects instead of down. Now let me take you back to where you guys are. If you think of those red line maps, the communities that lived in the red line areas modern day are the ones that most predominantly live not only in poverty, but are that disadvantaged communities. So Grand Rapids is almost double people who live in poverty just from all of Michigan. You guys know this, I'm sure, but that's not equal depending on where people live and of course because of ethnicity. That also translates into who can see a doctor or not. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen, the percentage of healthcare disparities in the county, for anybody that has coverage, 95.6%, I have this covered, there we go, are the white community, compared to 88% of Blacks. But if you look at who could not see a doctor in that past year due to cost, and keep in mind, this sounds like the Good Samaritan story, doesn't it? Remember, the Good Samaritan paid for all of the health care and all of the lodging, so they wouldn't go into poverty. But we see almost a 10% difference between Black and white neighbors in your county that could or could not see a doctor. And of course, you see that, unfortunately, with children as well. I just pulled out the data from lead poisoning that happens with children, and it's almost double for Blacks versus whites. And of course, the Hispanics population also have a higher rate. So we see, I think, the trickle up economics, we see an opportunity. This is from your area as well, the African American Health Institute. They ran the numbers and they said for every dollar you put in to community-based programs, this is at the base, you get a return to that community of almost $6. 5-time ROI return. To me, that sounds a lot like Jesus. And let me finish with a story. This was my favorite chapter to write. If you guys remember this chapter, it's on Nehemiah. In Nehemiah, if you look at the first chapter, at the very final verse, it's I was a cupbearer to the king. It's just who he was at the moment, right place at the right time. In my Bible, on the margins, I've written out in 2008, I'm a new mom. 2011, I'm a mom of a son. 2016, I finally graduated with my PhD. These markers of who I am. He would feel a pull to go and rebuild what was lost. And so he would go, he'd garner the people, and they would go rebuild the wall. Now, 2 people would go and would try to distract him. Tobias and San and Tove, Sanballat and Tobias. I call them San and Tove. I didn't remember their real names. And they would go up to him and say, people are talking poorly about you. You need to come and defend yourself. Now, any of us would probably say, okay, well, I'm coming because it's probably not true. He didn't take the bait. He just stayed doing his job. Then they came up a couple of days later and said, how about you just come have some coffee? Let's just talk about whatever. And he didn't take the bait there either. He said what I have hung in my home and in my office. He said, I'm doing a great work and I'm not coming down. I think the wisdom of living like Nehemiah or like a good neighbor is to know what our individual great works are and to not come down. A really practical example of that is, have you ever read something on Facebook from whoever and it just made you so mad, and you're washing dishes that night and you're still mad about it? Right? That is a distraction. That is something that we came down off of the wall of what we were supposed to be doing and building our own great work. And we got distracted by things that just don't matter. So for me, I've gotten off of social media completely. I just got off of it. I'm still on there professionally as the friendly neighbor, but certainly not individually. And I am much happier. And I'm also less distracted. I think part of being a neighbor is not being distracted, keeping our eyes on Jesus and that great work that we have. And also knowing that God passing by might be what we need. Do y'all remember the story with Moses when he asked, let me see your face? Do you remember that story? And instead of God saying, okay, here's my face, he didn't really answer him. He said, put your face in the cleft of the rock. And do you remember what he did after? He walked by him, and God could have said anything. This story fascinates me. He could have said, I've called you, have courage, whatever. But he said, the Lord is gracious and compassionate. He's slow to anger and he's rich in love. I think sometimes, because neighboring is so hard, when we ask the Lord, I just want to do something to help. I want to do my great work and not get distracted. Sometimes I think he puts us in the cleft of the rock and he walks by and reminds us of his character. And to me, I feel like that's so that we can go and walk by others and say, the Lord is gracious. And he's compassionate and he's slow to anger and he is rich in love. That is a non-distracted heart towards neighboring. It's also my favorite story in the Bible, which is why I get teared up every time. So this is the final slide. I think that you guys just ate around tables that I wish I could have eaten around too. The neighboring for me has redefined what a table looks like. Now, I'm a woman in science, and so most of the conferences I go to, there's not a lot of people who look like me at the head tables. I've been told if you want to get there, you have to jockey for position. It's a hustle culture, and there's only so many seats at that table. That might be true, but with God and faith, that is not the case. Faith lets us redefine a new table. That's a new focus. And to me, this is the one where the people, as the poorest, are brought to the middle and given a seat of honor. I think it harkens. Do you remember Psalm 23? God prepares for us a table in the presence of enemies. I'm about to publish a paper in conflict zones, enumerating. Sorry, guys, it's a little killer sweet. Enumerating the number of children who get caught up in the conflict zones worldwide. We have a God who will build a table there and ask for them to sit down. That is a table of honor. If you think of the other table in the when he's feeding the 5,000, do you remember that? He multiplied what people had. When we don't feel like we have it all, he can multiply that to be what is needed. Everybody has enough to eat, and when they go home, the disciples are left with baskets to take to their own home. That table of neighboring is where there's an abundance for everybody, plus including us when we feel tired. But at the center is the poor and people who need it the most. So I'm going to end there. I just so appreciate y'all letting me come. Hopefully it kept you awake because that's a whole lot of statistics. You can see my book, and I still write a newsletter on Substack, which is the QR code, but I'm more than happy to answer questions or see where I can fill in.
Hello, Dr. Smith. Hi, I'm Daniel Goldberg. I'm a biology professor here at Grand Island State University and a proud member of this congregation. I was wondering if you could speak on the nature of the Samaritan himself, because something that I read recently, which I think a lot of people miss for this story, but it seems so relevant for today, is that the Samaritan was an outsider. He was called by the people of Israel. The Samaritans were the enemy, the other. And yet he alone took care of this man who had been beaten half to death and left with nothing. So I think people need to remember that this was the neighbor who cared, especially this day and age where immigrants are being vilified and persecuted and imprisoned.
Yeah. Oh, you just said it for me. I don't know if I can say it better. That is, yeah, it's just an incredible part of the story. And to me, a man who came up to Jesus and said, "Who is my neighbor?" And it looks like that man was trying to get Jesus in a corner or something and try to surprise him. When Jesus told this story as an answer, he didn't answer with an answer. He answered with the story of the Samaritan. And it got to the part of, but a Samaritan man. Don't you think they were all like, oh, whoa, because it's not who they would have expected. You are exactly right. At that time, it would have been equivalent to an immigrant or fill in the blank of whoever is being vilified. And that was the person who was centered in the story. Now, when Jesus would finish telling the story, he would turn around to the man and he would say, "Now, who was the neighbor?" And that man would have had to say the Samaritan, or he walked away mad. We don't really know. But Jesus I think he was very sneaky in how he was telling a story, how he was saying something about who could, like the immigrants or whoever is vilified, maybe the poorest of the poor, people who you don't expect. He just centered him in the story. I love that. I didn't put enough of that in the book, but I would love to write about that sometime.
Thank you. I also appreciated the image showing the Holy Family interpreted as, I would assume, Middle Eastern refugees, because that's what we forget so often too. That Jesus was, despite the lily white blue sash wearing Americanized version we see erroneously shown of him, was a brown skinned Palestinian refugee.
Yes, with a young mother and they're running for their lives. I mean, the scenario similarities between the stories of the people trying to find a home or having to, right now just being very fearful of being caught and kicked out of their homes and um, deported. The similarities are very eerie, and so I just appreciate you bringing it up because I think in church settings, sometimes it's not talked about enough.
Well, it's unfortunate when that's the case because the people who don't want to talk about it are the same sort of people who would send you letters like that. Very tragic one that you showed us behind your back, but thank you again for sharing that and everything else, really.
Anybody else have anything else?
When you were talking, you never said what made you choose the country that you went to work in. I mean, there's problems all over the world, and
Oh.
how would you decide where you wanted to go?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I just followed whatever came into my lap. The Somaliland, when I was in my master's program, I watched a PBS documentary called Half the Sky. It's also a really good book if anybody needs a book. And one of the people that they talked about, the legends of women who hold up half the sky, that's the people they talked about, was Dr. Edna Adan. Her grandfather was one of the founders of Somaliland. She's legendary, and so is her family. So my first conference that I spoke at after, this is about the science stuff, in 2016 when I got my PhD, she was there too. Oh, so I had a little freak out moment and just went up to her and I don't remember. It was probably a whole lot of, I just love you. Can I take a selfie? And she said yes. And then I got up enough nerve later on to go and say, I'm an epidemiologist. Can I do anything for your country? Not, I didn't know what that was going to be. And she said yes. So then I had to figure it out. Okay, what do we do? And then that just started a relationship and a friendship with her that I'm still just floored to have. Burundi was a similar kind of problem or kind of story, except once I was in Somaliland, I learned that that need was, I mean, it's just the poorest of the poor. The only other poorer countries are Niger and Burundi. And I just happened to meet people in Burundi. So I said, can I come and help? So that's kind of the evolution. The war zone was when I went to the UN and we saw such a significant predictor of going into poverty based on children's health. And then Ukraine happened, and then Gaza happened. Then we just decided we need to look at it from a data standpoint to try to advocate again at the United Nations type level for protection for children specifically and for hospitals. So I mean, Somaliland built my courage. I am not naturally a aggressive person at all. If you would have told me 20 years ago I'd be doing what I'm doing right now, I would not have believed you because I'm a pastor's wife and I love that role. But Somaliland taught me what happens when you step out in faith and when you're a little bit courageous. Burundi built on that, and I think now that I'm doing the work with the conflict zones, and part of that is with St. Jude, that's a whole other story. I needed the courage to know, you can still do it. So that's how I got started. Thank you.
All right, what do you think?
Thank you. All right, here we go. One more.
Your story reminded me of a book that's coming out in March by Father Richard Rohr, Franciscan priest, and it's called Millions of Things. And in his book, he talks about the prophets of the Bible, the great prophets, and he says that their message, all of them, was it's not the sin of the individual, but the sin of the system that has to be addressed. And it sounds like that's your job, and epidemiology is the system addressing its failures and the need for all of us to find and support those systems that are fair and just for all. Thank you for your great lecture.
Oh, thank you. I think you're right on the money on that one too. That that does feel like what I'm trying to do is to treat the systems, but to not walk by. I tell my students the Good Samaritan story, not in a faith way, but just in a way to try to focus on the poor or the systems that surround that poor. So I think you're right. I also think that there's such an opportunity for churches to understand these concepts of the redlining and the communities and the poverty. And I mean, I know that this church is one that does outreach and loves people. And there's so many after COVID that are like yours that are asking the question of how do we do that more on a system level or on a way of working with your city council members or mayors. One opportunity is to look at the history of a place or some of those demographic data that I showed, and just see the people within it. So I think you're right. I had not heard of that book, but I love Richard Rohr. So now I'm going to have to look at it.
Thank you all very much. I'm sure we could ask questions all night long, but we are getting close to our hour. Before we go though, want to say a couple of thank yous. First of all, obviously to Dr. Smith, so we can wrap up.
Oh, thank you.
What we should do here is highlight the group so that they can all like wave to you. There you go. Wave. Thank you.
Oh,
Everybody all at once there. We really appreciate you being here. And just being able to share so openly and join us this way and learn about our city too as you were preparing. It was really lovely. So thank you for that. And also everybody who made soups, everybody who set up, and everyone who's going to clean up. It takes a whole village, and you are an amazing village, and we appreciate all of you. We also were fortunate enough to get a ThriveEnt grant for this event. So we received a $250 grant that helped offset the cost of our dinner and some of the books. Again, if anybody wants, I have one here. I think there's a couple other books too, so you can pick up the book. But it's Gail Volkerding, are you still here? She has to get up really early tomorrow, but she came and graciously applied for the grant in our behalf. So thank you very much. I think to close us out tonight, Pastor John would like to do a benediction or prayer.
Kristen, can I say one more thing before y'all pray?
Absolutely.
With the federal freezes and the foreign aid freezes that are happening, my work unfortunately has been affected, where I am at risk of losing my whole team. We are starting a fund to try to do more like a GoFundMe to try to keep that team, and that's in El Salvador and the war zones in Somaliland. It is all of them. But the first group or the first amount of money that we're going to put in that is from you guys. So y'all will be the first donations to keep those teams alive, this children's cancer care, and with St. Jude. So I just will always be thankful. You guys will always hold a special place in my heart for that. So thank you very much.
That's really awesome to hear, and I didn't follow my notes, but what I did want to say is, as a thank you for your presentation, we did send an honorarium, and so it's nice to know what that's going to. So good job, everybody.
Let's also give Kristen our thanks for putting together this wonderful. The Lord be with you. O God, gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in love, we thank you for coming to walk beside us in Jesus, our Good Samaritan, our great physician, who tends to our needs in body, mind, and spirit, who pays the full cost for our redemption, and calls us to go and do likewise, to be merciful as you are merciful. Thank you for this time together tonight. Thank you for the Spirit moving among us, raising up questions, moving our hearts, helping us to step outside of our comfort zones, to serve our neighbors. And you tell us who our neighbors are. They are all your children. As we go into the night, give us a peaceful night and a quiet rest. Bless us with your abiding peace now and always. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God's blessings and peace to you.